So I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful event, and particularly also Dr. Abusede Ibadeola, for all this initiative and energy the women here in the League of African Women Philosophers are putting in networking. And I'm very happy to and grateful to be part of this conference today. My own field of research is mainly the history of philosophy. And therefore, in the following, I will discuss selected specific challenges for reconstructing the history of philosophy from a feminist as well as a global perspective, taking Africa and the African diaspora here as a case study. And I think in my talk, or what I would like to present here, I can link very well to previous speakers like Tanella Boni, for example, who already pointed to the lack of African women philosophers in the history of philosophy. Now, what I would like to do in the following minutes is to introduce the problem, or to describe the problem a bit of reconstructing the history of women philosophers, and to describe the challenges we are facing in the historiography of philosophy. Then I would like to discuss the challenges on three concrete examples, namely Valata Petros from the 17th century, Phyllis Wheatley from the 18th century, and Nana Asmau from the 19th century before I conclude. Until today, it can be said that little attention is paid to the contribution of a woman to philosophy and its history. Astonishingly, the absence of women philosophers in departments, in the curriculum, and also in survey works is rarely perceived as a shortcoming. Moreover, prejudices that assume that women are either incapable of doing philosophy or only capable of doing it to a very limited extent, and that their achievements in the discipline are mediocre at best, have been widespread until recent times. I could give now examples here from ancient Greek philosophy like Aristotle, up to Kant and Hegel, up to very recent philosophy. Or I could also point to the debate during the 15th, 16th century, where it was really discussed as to whether women are human beings at all. I'm sure that all of you know such examples, so I will not explore this deeper here. A misogynistic attitude is also reflected in the writings on the history of philosophy, in fact, worldwide. As a research of our Hildesheim Reinhard Korsalik project, Histories of Philosophy in a Global Perspective, shows. Here is the homepage of this research project, and I've been putting the link to the research project and to this database of histories of philosophy in the chat. In the almost 30 languages in which we have collected and analyzed books and manuscripts on the history of philosophy from different centuries, women are everywhere underrepresented or not mentioned at all. So not only in English, French, German, there's a lack of mentioning women philosophers, but we find the same lack in Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, or Korean histories of philosophy. Only in recent decades has the research on women philosophers gained momentum, and so far mainly in English, French, Italian, and German, there are quite a number of works found. So here, for example, is the beginning of the list of histories of women philosophers in English. So if you go into this database, and I provided the link in the chat, and look for the histories of women philosophers, then you can explore the titles there. And we have the same collection in French and other languages. where we find histories of philosophy, of women philosophers. Now, in recent decades, also a great effort has been exerted worldwide in intercultural philosophy or global philosophy to bring to light historical and contemporary philosophical traditions excluded from the dominant discourse so far. However, little has been done to include women philosophers in these discourses and works. The program of making philosophical traditions from all regions of the world visible in academic discourse and integrating them into teaching and research on an equal footing has so far not extended to women philosophers' works in those traditions. On the contrary, the same gender bias that we are already familiar with from Europe and North American philosophy pervades regional as well as global histories of philosophy to a large extent. For example, a brief examination of publications in German and English from the 1980s to the 2000 years shows that with very few exceptions, women philosophers are not included in the reconstruction of histories of philosophy, for example, in the Islamic world, in India, in China. The same applies to the reconstruction of South American and African philosophies. In the case of Africa, there is a development. While Dismas Masolo mentions no woman in his otherwise fantastic book on the history of African philosophy in the 20th century, African Philosophy in Search of Identity, Barry Holland mentions the gender question and some representatives of feminist philosophy in chapter 8 of his book, A Short History of African Philosophy. And Peter Adamson, who initiated a podcast under the title History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, has a series on Africana philosophy here included, and he portrays numerous Black women philosophers, however, with a focus on the African diaspora in North America. Also, we have some examples of progress in writing the history of women philosophers and of African and Black women philosophers. Nevertheless, we are still essentially at the beginning. Until today, there's a research gap unaddressed by intercultural philosophy, feminist and gender studies, as well as regional and global histories of philosophy. So who tells the story of African and Black women philosophers? The task that philosophical research faces today is to establish an intersectional approach as an important methodological tool also for the discipline of history of philosophy. But writing a history of philosophy from an intersectional approach faces certain challenges. And let me mention here just a few of the important challenges we are facing. We have to overcome a tradition of thought or worldview that a priori denies that women have the intellectual ability to philosophize. We have to overcome traditions and schools of philosophy in which basic philosophical concepts such as reason, rationality, or objectivity connote masculinity. We have to investigate the structural causes that have led to the exclusion of women philosophers and their works from the canon of the discipline. We have to study the structural causes that have prevented women from engaging in intellectual activities like philosophizing. And we have to elaborate of methods and the identification of sources for the reconstruction of the knowledge of women philosophers. The last point in particular, the question of sources, confronts us as historians of philosophy with special challenges. This is because women philosophers often expressed their thoughts not in academic treatises, but in other forms of expressions such as letters, fragments, literature, epigrams, and sometimes without any written legacy at all. Sometimes their thoughts have been passed down through oral statements. Now, orality is one of the most difficult and complex challenges for the text-centered discipline of history of philosophy. There has barely been any opening in the discipline of the history of philosophy to study non-written sources, materials, and practices. Reconstructing the history of a philosophy based on oral traditions is difficult to begin with, but how can women's philosophical knowledge be recovered in such a context? It seems an almost hopeless endeavor. Authorship of oral philosophies is mostly unknown, and traditions with gender-neutral languages present further complications. For example, Oyeronke Oyewumi's study in the Yoruba language, The Invention of Woman, shows that there are no gender-specific words in Yoruba. But how then to find female philosophers? How can we deal with this source situation? One possibility has been opened by the philosopher Sophie Oluwole. In her book, Socrates and Orunmila, a figure from Orunmila, a male figure from the Ifa corpus of the Yoruba, whom she reads as a historical figure and philosopher. So perhaps also female sages or scholars can also be named and located in this way by studying such oral resources. Another way to reconstruct the philosophical knowledge of a woman was already mentioned in one of the previous papers today, is the Sage Philosophy project of Henry Odera Oruka. And the presenter in the morning was right to criticize that Odera Oruka interviewed or published only one interview with a female sage, but there are other colleagues, such as the American philosopher Gail Presby, who continued research in sage philosophy from a feminist perspective. So Gail Presby did a lot of interviews with women sages in Kenya and also in other regions of the continent. Moreover, there are narrative traditions as well as religious or cultural practices that were passed on only matrilineally or in female peer groups. And so perhaps there's also philosophizing that is practiced only by women. This could possibly be a starting point for reconstructing knowledge specifically transmitted by women in oral traditions, which could be examined for its philosophical relevance. This is, for the discipline of the history of philosophy, an unusual and, moreover, tentatively explored approach to reconstructing philosophical knowledge, and its outcome is uncertain. Nevertheless, not only African history of philosophy, but also feminist, European, and North American historiographies of philosophy can benefit immediately from discussions about oral philosophy, for example, by expanding source materials. In North America, this question particularly concerns the reconstruction for the philosophical knowledge of First Nation people and Black women. And we have the same issue for, of course, also in South America or in Australia and New Zealand. From a feminist perspective, the reconstruction of the philosophical heritage in oral traditions entails a number of challenges that have hardly been considered so far. But even in cases where written materials exist, the reconstruction of female philosophers' concepts poses specific challenges to us. Since here we are confronted with text genres that are not usually considered legitimate sources in the prevailing discourse of the history of philosophy, such as poems and other literary forms, religious texts, hagiographies, and letters. And I would like to show up three examples from three different centuries here now. Let me begin with Valata Petros. The hagiography of Valata Petros, a Christian nun who was given the status of a saint in the Ethiopian Coptic Church because of her resistance to the Catholicization of Ethiopia, illustrates the methodological challenges. We have no transmitted texts from Valata Petros herself. Our knowledge of her life, deeds, views, and statements has been handed down exclusively within the framework of a hagiography. Valata Petros was born in 1592 to a noble family in Ethiopia. During the religious wars in the Ethiopian Empire in the 17th century, as a result of the Portuguese Jesuits' attempt to Catholicize the country, she refused to convert to Catholicism, left her husband, and became a nun of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. She began to protest publicly against the Jesuits and started founding religious communities with people who wanted to escape Roman Catholicism. Her own life was characterized by strict asceticism. She never slept in a bed, wore the simplest clothes and never shoes, ate only vegetables, and put ashes in her food to make it less palatable. Also, she was the head of her community and came from a noble family. She did heavy work herself. Now, Valata Petros is an important part of the religious and historical context of 17th century Ethiopia, both as an example of lived non-violent resistance and in terms of the establishment of Coptic monastic communities and the strict ascetic rules of life designed from them. But was she a philosopher? That her resistance to the Jesuit influence and the political as well as religious subjugation of Coptic Ethiopia to the rule of Catholicism, as well as her independence from male decision makers, be it her husband or the emperor, is an expression of firm political, religious, and moral positions, cannot be doubted. Nevertheless, it is not easy to decide whether a hagiography offers sufficient and reliable sources with which to justify Valata Petros' inclusion in a history of philosophy. At least two objections are to be expected here. The first generally concerns the status of hagiographies as source material for a history of philosophy. The second objection could amount to criticizing unequal treatment of man and woman, for if the existence of a saint's vita should be sufficient to declare a woman a philosopher, would this approach not also have to be used for a re-evaluation of male thinkers? The life descriptions of saints are not stringent biographies, but tell of miracles and mysteries that are supposed to justify a canonization. In most cases, the stories were first passed on orally and only written down long after the death of the person concerned, in the case of Valata Petros, 30 years after her death. For this reason, considerable doubts can be raised against this kind of narrative as the truthfulness of the deeds and statements of a person that have been handed down. If we look for a moment at the canon of female philosophers established so far in the literature, we come across some hagiographies of saints. And one of the maybe most outstanding examples or most well-known examples is, of course, Hildegard von Bingen, Hildegard of Bingen, who was canonized and has, in the meantime, a firm place in the dictionaries and encyclopedias of women philosophers. Hildegard von Bingen is documented as a historical person, and some of her writings have survived. Hildegard has been writing a considerable number of treatises and letters. So here, in this case, her hagiography alone is not the material on which the inclusion in the history of philosophy is based. In addition, there are the concepts and writings which have been handed down. A decision as to the extent to which philosophical relevant material can be found in a saint's life description that justifies the inclusion of a person in a history of philosophy must be made on the basis of the concrete example in each case. This is my hypothesis. So perhaps there are saint vitae of women and men that justify this. In the case of Alata Petros, it is a very detailed text that describes her biography and the historical context quite accurately. The same applies to various incidents from her life which are particularly related to her lived faith. Philosophically relevant questions are reflected here more in her actions, such as the establishment of Coptic monastic communities in resistance to the introduction of Catholicism, in the strict rules of life drafted for her communities or her asceticism, and less in the relatively rare explicitly mentioned statements she is said to have made. Nevertheless, the text offers source material for philosophical debates, the non-violent resistance as well as metaphysical questions concerning the relationship between body and soul. So this can be a starting point for further philosophical investigations. Now, let me turn to another example from the 18th century and from the African diaspora, namely Phyllis Wheatley, and I think many of you might know her. Phyllis Wheatley, who was brought to North America as a slave and who was the first Black woman to have her poetry published, is a central figure in African-American literary history. But today, her work is increasingly being analyzed also from a philosophical perspective. Wheatley was probably born in the area of Senegambian coast and fell into slavery at the age of 7. In Boston, she was bought by John Wheatley, who ensured that she received a good education. So she was taught Latin, Greek, mythology, and history, and she started writing poems in English already in a very early age, namely with 12, 13. She wrote her first poem, and a few years later, in 1773, her collection of poems was published under the title Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Unfortunately, she died very early in the age of 31 already. The fate of Phyllis Wheatley is an exceptional case because, on the one side, the legal status as a slave made it almost impossible for men and women to acquire education and gain economically secure space for intellectual work. And in addition, as a woman, Wheatley faced all prejudices about the intellectual abilities of women. So for Black women in particular, conditions for intellectual work were particularly difficult and remained almost unchanged after the abolition of slavery. For example, there is an interesting statement of the famous Black abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass, who stated in 1892, I quote, "I have so far seen no book of importance written by a Black woman, and I know of no one among us who can appropriately be called famous." Well, in view of a situation in which racist and sexist prejudices intersect, it is almost a miracle that Phyllis Wheatley was able to become an intellectual at all, even more so in a language which was not her mother tongue. Phyllis Wheatley is now a central figure in African-American literary history, but does she belong to a history of philosophy? If one reads her poems and letters carefully, those media of expression that were available to her, who never received a philosophical education, a concept of freedom is reflected here that might justify inclusion in a history of philosophy, even if these thoughts remain fragmentary. Let me give just one example here from a letter which she sent to Reverend Samson Occom. Here she states, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And I will assert that the same principle lives in us. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. I think this is such a wonderful statement of her in the letter, which shows how brilliant she was, because what she is doing here is at the one hand showing that a principle or a love for freedom is inherent in every human being. And on the other side, she shows how concepts of freedom are also used in a very one-sided thing, namely pointing to the cry of liberty of the fathers of the United States who wanted to become independent from Britain, but at the same time have been slave owners. So, I mean, from such a young woman, I think it is really a very remarkable statement and observation of the contradictions inside the works and speeches of the founders of the United States. I think the case of Phyllis Wheatley is an important example of the need to consider a wide corpus of texts when reconstructing philosophical knowledge of marginalized and oppressed groups. So let me turn now to my last example from the 19th century. And Nana Asmau was already mentioned today and maybe yesterday. She is one of the outstanding examples of a woman intellectual of the 19th century. So let me just explain my thoughts about if she should be included or not included in the history of philosophy. First of all, there's little documentation of the work of women philosophers in the Islamic world, especially from the early centuries. The thinkers we still know today include Rabia of Basra from the 8th century, a former slave who is considered an important source of inspiration for Sufism, or Fatima of Cordoba, a Sufi master and teacher of the renowned philosopher Ibn Arabi. For the African continent, and here in particular the region south of the Sahara, there are hardly any writings of learned women known. And for this reason, and in this respect, it is good luck that we have Nana Asmau from the Sokoto Caliphate, even so we are now already in the 19th century. Nana Asmau, the daughter of the Caliph Uthman Danfodio, is maybe the most famous of a number of educated and influential women from the family of Uthman Danfodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate. Like her father, her brothers, and her sisters, Nana Asmau had enjoyed an extensive classical Islamic education. She was familiar with the classics of the Arab world and antiquity, spoke 4 languages, and enjoyed great public prestige as an influential scholar. In her more than 60 surviving works from a creative period of around 40 years, Nana Asmau has left behind a rich collection of poems in Arabic, Fulfulde, and Hausa. Here is such an example of a text by Nana Asmau. Many of Asmau's texts are historical accounts, but her work also includes teaching poems to help women and men learn the basic principles of the caliphate. To this extent, poems and teaching texts were written that served as an aid to understand the basic texts of Islam. In addition, they offered guidance for a life pleasing to God. So let me give an example. here. In this text, two aspects of Nana Asmau's teachings become obvious. It's a short extract of a poem called A Warning, written in 1856. First, it emphasizes the great importance of education. Acquiring education is considered a legitimate reason that allows women to leave the house. For in Islam, as is emphasized here, the pursuit of education is a religious duty. Secondly, it reveals that Nana Asmau is a representative of a conservative understanding of gender relations, according to which women and men are assigned gender-specific social and family roles, and women's sphere of activity is essentially assigned to the private sphere of the home. However, while Nana Asmau emphasizes that a wife must obey her husband, she limits obedience by stating that women must only comply to the husband's lawful demands. Which demands are lawful and which are not can only be determined by studying the scriptures of the Quran, a study to which women should also be devoted. Now, is Nana Asmau a philosopher? Many people are taking her as a philosopher today. She is, as Tanella Boni said in the morning already, part of this new or recently published collection, The History of Women Philosophers, the first 4,000 years, as one of only two African women philosophers. In contrast to the two thinkers I discussed earlier, Nana Asmau is an example of a thinker who was not only firmly anchored in a particular epistemic framework, the Islamic theology and philosophy, but also in the power structures of her context, the Sokoto Caliphate. Women's rights, such as the right to education, are justified and explored by her within this framework alone. The framework itself is not questioned, and neither is the scope of action and the position of women. Moral values are taken from the Holy Scripture and perpetuated as instructions for action. Not only for a liberal understanding of women's emancipation or religious conservative positions, in which patriarchal gender relations are not questioned or challenged. The example of Nana Asmau is also problematic from the point of view of philosophical relevance, as her texts lack a critical distance to given norms and existing views. It is not a question of having to detach oneself from the religious framework, but rather of argumentatively examining, justifying, or rejecting given norms with the means of exegesis of the sacred text or with reference to preceding philosophical discourses. Nana Asmau's poem is first and foremost an instruction for behavior that corresponds to the religious framework and should make harmonious social coexistence possible. Whoever violates the given rules must be facing with the corresponding consequences in this world, but above all in the hereafter. There's no weighing of different arguments, but only the one true path. And here I think is a lack of critical thinking. And to make it short, because I think I have to come to my conclusions now, I think that one should really very critically think about including Nana Asmau in a history of philosophy, in a history of intellectual developments in Africa, yes, in a history of idea, in a history of theology, but I have some objections to include her into a history of philosophy because of a lack of critical thinking. I think we can maybe discuss this in the discussion later. Let me jump to my conclusions now. I think writing the history of women philosophers means to be open for a diversity of expressions and sources beside academic texts, because women may have used different modes of expression than their male counterparts. I think a feminist historiography of philosophy consists not only in a process of inclusion, but also in a process of selection and thus also of exclusion, because I think it doesn't make sense to include all women thinkers in the history of philosophy. A criterion for inclusion or exclusion is, of course, our respective understanding of philosophy. And as I try to make obvious here, is the critical function of philosophy, a core aspect of philosophizing, at least in my opinion. And a proper revision of the canon of the history of philosophy cannot be carried out only from a global perspective, but must also address and correct patriarchal structures of exclusion in all regions of the world. Now, a last thing which I would like to mention. As the examples given show, writing a history of women philosophers is a demanding and difficult undertaking in which established paths have to be abandoned and new methods tried out. But why should we actually put ourselves through such an effort? Why fight on in this historical area when there are so many contemporary problems to solve? I see at least 2 or 3 points to answer such questions. First, our understanding of the past influences and shapes our understanding of the present and a possible future. In our context, this means that the lack of women philosophers in historical narratives can also justify the exclusion or lack of support for women philosophers in the present and future. Second, a change of the epistemic frame we are operating in is possible or is supported by including concepts of women from the history of philosophy. And third, a very practical argument, young female philosophers need role models, both for their understanding of philosophy and for their career planning, and not only from contemporary women philosophers, but also from the history. So I end with a plea, namely I hope that more women philosophers, also more African women philosophers, get interested in our subdiscipline of history of philosophy and contribute to an extended history of philosophy, which is inclusive concerning the regional varieties of philosophical traditions, as well as including more women in the history of philosophy. Thank you very much for your attention.